Thank you, Minister, and thanks for continuing the theme of actually finishing with a challenge back to all of us. For the next two presenters, there's a challenge for you. Can you leave us actually with a further challenge as well? There's a wide range of issues. I'm not going to try and summarise those that were covered in the Minister's speech, but the focus on regulatory reform and taxation reform and definitions of charities featured large, and I'm sure there'll be some questions from the audience in relation to both of those points. But let's keep moving. Senator Rachel Siewert's up next. Please welcome her.
Before I start, I'd like to pick up on the issue of what changes we've seen under this government from the previous government, and one important change, which is very dear to my heart, is the issue around advocacy and getting rid of those gag clauses out of the contracts that you're required to sign. That was an essential change for this sector. And I never ever want to see the change back where we think it's acceptable in this country that we can effectively gag NGOs to the point so that all they are, and I say that, I don't mean to devalue that, but I consider an essential part of the service that the not-for-profit sector deliver is advocacy. And to restrict NGOs from being able to do that, or the not-for-profit sector, I never want to see that in this country again. An important point that important question that Frank didn't ask, which I'd like to ask, and maybe I should also ask for the lights to be changed just to see if I can do it too, is how many of you have staff who don't know whether they're going to have a job after July because you don't know if you're going to be funded for particular contracts? I thought as much. And it's the same across the board in the not-for-profit sector, where people don't know because of the way that the regulatory process is carried out at the moment. It's another part about staff management is actually where the staff know if they've got a job, and you're not concentrating fully on your job here if you don't know if you've got a job and if you're off looking for another job just in case. And how many of you have lost excellent staff expertise because they've had to move because they didn't know what their future is going to be? That is not sustainable for the sector either. When we talk about reform, I get the distinct impression that there are in fact about 3 or more views of what the definition of reform means. That view held by the sector, the view by the government, as in the ministers in the caucus, and then the view of the bureaucracy. It is very clear from what I understand of the sector, but that when they talk about reform, what they have in mind is, or what you have in mind is a less fragmented and inefficient environment across regulatory funding, reporting and taxation frameworks and mechanisms, reducing the burden of red tape, inappropriate and excessive contractual and reporting requirements, and more meaningful measures and reports, better access to useful data, quality improvement processes and mechanisms that drive change. My impression is that when the departments think about reform, they are thinking entirely of reform as something that is done by them to the sector, and has nothing to do with the reform of departmental processes, governance, contracting, reporting requirements, or their public accountability, etc. It seems that the driving force behind this approach to reform is that all about managing political risk, controlling the not-for-profits, and for delivering cheaper services, i.e. services that is cheaper for you to deliver than for the government or the agencies to be delivering. This is not the same as managing the risks to clients or to service providers. If there aren't services available, if there are gaps in services or for some problems or places or for risk groups. This is an approach that leads to a profusion of more complex and restrictive contracting and reporting requirements, leading to an increasing compliance burden on services, one that at the same time as it's taking away resources from service delivery and has little to do with improving the quality of those services or the targeting of their delivery. I think people will recall the Auditor General's report, the Auditor General's report of a couple of years ago that looked at how departments look at reports for not-for-profits when they report on contracts, etc. And most of those reports were put in a drawer and never looked at. So even those, and I personally don't think the situation's improved that much better. In other words, you're reporting, but it's not leading to quality change or change in the delivery of the way the agencies are supporting the services. What we understand the sector wants, and I've done a lot of consultation with the sector to look at what the sector wants in terms of reform. And I understand that the sector wants a fair go and better outcome for disadvantaged Australians. A more sustainable sector, a fair go for workers and services, better, simple and more meaningful regulation, and a voice at the table, real partnership and not just lip service to partnership. Security of social services for vulnerable and disadvantaged Australians, to me, means long-term sustainable funding levels and methods, government funding to cover the outcomes of pay claims before Fair Work Australia, without reducing the quality and number of services. We need extra funding from government to be put in to the not-for-profit sectors, to service providers, so that workers can be paid fairly and that there's no decrease in the services that are provided. We also need government funding to cover the increased superannuation guarantee levy. We need modernising of the taxation regime for not-for-profit organisations, and that includes restoring the value of the fringe benefits tax cap and fixing, and also will acknowledge that there needs to be some reform there for where this is being, where this isn't being, or it's being manipulated, that's fixed. I do acknowledge there's a need for that. What is government working with the sector to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of services for vulnerable and disadvantaged Australians look like, and what does it mean? We believe it means developing policy and planning the delivery of services through a real partnership with the sector, working closely on the detail and the implementation. And of course, that means there needs to be funding to be able to do that. Working with social services in the same way it works with industry, to improve funding processes, tendering arrangements, reporting and financial acquittals. A workforce with the right knowledge and skills to meet current and future community needs with sufficient numbers of workers on decent wages. Reforming and harmonising regulation across Commonwealth and state and territory boundaries, reducing red tape through the standardisation of universal reporting. I've heard it many times, and I'm sure you've heard it many times. Report once, use often. What does a meaningful relationship between the government and the sector look like? It means honouring the principles of the National Compact and act on the key priorities, making it real. We believe at the moment there is a disconnect between the principle and the practice. And I'll mention because I can't not mention it, the Northern Territory intervention, income management, compliance, and the new compliance bill. How many of you had effective and meaningful consultation on that new compliance bill? It means an independent regulatory body for the sector that regulates and advocates for the sector and disadvantaged Australians, not just a body that imposes regulation on the sector. We're deeply concerned about what that body will do and how effectively it will work with the sector, and it comes back to those issues of partnership. Let me pick up on that, just go a little bit further on that from our point of view. We would like to see an independent statutory authority or commission that is properly resourced to do the job, that has as its missions a very clear mandate to improve the quality and sustainability of services in the interests of disadvantaged and vulnerable Australians by being an advocate to government and to the public. This means somebody who is in the first place on the side of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable, and in the second place can stand up for the best interests of the sector to government without fear or favour. The principles outlined in the productivity report that we've been talking about this morning are perhaps a good place to start, and maybe we could pick that up in some discussion. In my discussions with the sector, what the term that people have been using recently is the term a perfect storm. The not-for-profit sector faces the coincidence of a number of issues, each of which on its own represents a concern for the sector's sustainability. Taken together, they provide and create a real threat to the viability of the sector, which is why people are describing it as a perfect storm. We have the wage case, with between 18 and a 30% increase potentially in wages. And we all absolutely agree this is needed, and I've been at the rallies advocating for this. But I also am fully aware, as I mentioned earlier, that the sector cannot support that without increased resources.